This episode is brought to you by Rad Dudes Who Love Nature.
Fawns are like the cutest things ever out there.
I don't know. I saw a coyote pup in the Poconos that might have been the cutest animal I've ever seen in my life.
Hi folks, on this episode we jumped into talking to the guest before we did a proper introduction, so here it is. Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. As usual, you can get in touch with us on email. That's our favorite way, at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. We are not so active on social media these days. Please do rate the podcast on your podcast listening app of choice and tell all your friends about it. Please do support us on Patreon, on the Wildlife Observer Network account. That gets to us. Again, we don't really make much money on this. We don't make any money on this. We're lucky if if the Patreon can help us with a few of the expenses for keeping a podcast on the air or on the internet. We appreciate every bit that somebody contributes. So thanks in advance for doing that. And thanks everybody who does support us on Patreon. The conversation kicks in as we were talking about mange, a really terrible disease caused by tiny mites that coyotes and lots of other dogs and dog-related animals are susceptible to.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's such a devastating disease. It's really hard to watch, and it makes the animal more visible to people, so the public actually sees the disease, whereas they don't get to see that with other viruses or bacteria, that type of thing. And so that's probably one of the things that we get calls about during our project is that when a coyote is infected with mange, the whole neighborhood is watching it, and it's on social media. It may be at a cemetery or a golf course or something like that, and so then it may be radio collared, and so then they contact us and they ask us, like, what are you going to do about it? Like, are you going to do something to help this animal? And it's a really difficult, sticky issue, for sure.
Stan, I want to jump on something real quick. How do you pronounce the name of Canis latrans in English?
Usually I say coyote. Every once in a while I get suckered into saying coyote. But as I'm sure you know, both pronunciations are fine. And in fact, coyotes, that's the majority decision. I think that I'm definitely in the minority. So there's that.
Well, I feel like this is something that I've heard on the Meat Eater podcast where they get into this, is that how you relate to coyotes determines how you pronounce coyote. Like if you're someone who tries to shoot them, then you're definitely going to call them a coyote. And if you're someone who earliest familiarity with them was as a cartoon character chasing a roadrunner, then it's coyote.
Yeah.
And then Dan, the guy, we're jumping right into conversation without any introduction, but
should we just start, Billy, then? You think?
Well, we finished the thought, and then but we keep having thoughts. But Dan Flores' book, Coyote America, is that the name of it? Coyote America, I think.
Yeah.
He gets into, I think, the question of that the original Nahuatl word for it would have been something like coyotl or something like that, which wouldn't have had a vowel at the end of it. But in Spanish, you really can't end a word like that. So it became coyote in Spanish. So we are, so in a way, like whether you're claiming the earliest pronunciation or the one that got into English, both are right.
Right.
But this is the problem with having a guest we're so excited to talk to, is that we can't even stop for an introduction. So welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. I'm here, Billy Brown. We got Tony Crow. What's Tony Crow on your?
It's just faster than typing out Crowsdale.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay. And we have an illustrious guest with us. Stan, go ahead. Who are you?
I'm Stan Gehrt. I'm a professor of wildlife ecology at Ohio State University.
Awesome.
Wait, you just said, isn't it the Ohio State?
Yes, actually, legally, I'm supposed to say the Ohio State University. That is the actual legal name.
We don't want to get you in trouble, man. So
I know. I just have a hard time because everyone else outside of Ohio thinks it's very pretentious. And so I don't like to feed into that pretentiousness. But
I grew up in
technically, that's
Central
correct.
Ohio. I grew up in Bexley, and
Ah,
my dad worked for the university. No one ever called it the Ohio State University.
I know.
It was
We
just
don't.
just Ohio State.
I just think it's kind of cool and quirky. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, it's always in football because they have the guys like doing their little intro things. They're always, and you can tell they're made to say it because they're all like the Ohio State University.
Yep.
Not like there's another Ohio State University that they're trying to differentiate it from.
No, but it was interesting. I mean, the original name at the very beginning of the creation of the university, it was not the Ohio State University. So they actually made a name change and they put the there, and there were reasons why they did that. But it was to set the university aside or set it apart from other Ohio universities. And so they wanted it there, and they paid. I mean, it cost a lot of money to put that "the" there in front. So they want to see it there.
Well, go Bucks.
Right.
So we've got the occasion for the conversation with Stan is well, I'm holding this up even though we're in a podcast. Coyotes Among Us, new book about the secrets of the city's top predator, and so we'll be talking about that. But like, I have a feeling that for the most part, you're going to have a lot of conversations when you're promoting the book, talking about coyotes in a very introductory way. Whereas Tony and I have probably been saving up questions for you for 10 years. And so,
Oh no.
I guess, give us a really quick introduction. Is how did you get into the urban coyote business?
Yeah, so I was fresh off of my PhD at the University of Missouri. The first job I got was as a research biologist at the Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation, which is a private foundation located in the Chicago metro area. And just because of its location, more than anything else, you just end up doing urban wildlife studies. I was not trained in urban wildlife. All of my graduate background and my reasons for getting into wildlife was all about wilderness and working out in the remote areas as far away from people as you can possibly get. I was actually born and raised in Kansas, which is a rural state, and so I had no desire, no interest in urban stuff, but I ended up there. I thought I would only spend a year or two there until I would get the job that I really loved. But I ended up staying there. And so I was working on research on the typical urban stuff. So the raccoons, skunks, bats, that type of thing. And then in the late 1990s, so I've been there for about 5 years, had developed a relationship with some of the agencies there in the Chicago region. And all of a sudden, especially Cook County Animal Control began getting complaints or at least questions of concern from residents in different parts of Cook County, Illinois, about seeing coyotes in areas where no one had ever seen coyotes before, and it's very close to where people are living. In fact, in their neighborhoods, and they were very scared about it. And so the agency asked me if we would design a really quick study, just like a 1-year study, to look at coyotes in the Chicago region and to try and answer some questions about what's going on there and what is the right response when people contact an agency and are scared or complaining about the animal. So that was how it started, and then it just kind of blew up from there. And we ended up doing this long-term study that's still continuing today. So that was back in 2000 is when we caught our first and radio collared our first coyote. And we're literally radio collaring coyotes today as of last week.
what do you do with the coyotes? Or coyotes? What do you like? You catch a coyote, and then what happens?
Mm-hmm. So catch a coyote. I mean, what we do with them really depends on what our objectives are, what the questions are that we're trying to answer. And so the questions that we're trying to answer really require us to capture the animals. We take them back to the lab. So we can't process them out in the field because the field in the Chicago area is often very exposed to the public, to dogs, that type of thing. So for the coyote's sake, as well as for our sake, we quickly get them out of a trap. We transport them to our lab where we can, safely process them. And so we'll measure them. We'll collect some samples from them. We'll ear tag them for permanent markings, and then we'll radio collar them. And the radio collars allow us to follow them to determine what's their space use relative to people. And then it also provides us information on their survival and if they do die, what are their causes of mortality. So really important measures for us in terms of understanding how they're responding to us, as well as their relationships to us as well.
A question about the radio tracking. Do you ever get weird looks when you're walking around like neighborhoods with these receivers and like your headphones on?
Right. Oh, in the early years of the study, absolutely. In fact, not only did we get strange looks from people would stop us and ask us, like, what are you doing? Or in some cases, especially at night. So a lot of our radio tracking is at night because that's when the coyotes are pretty active. And on more than one occasion, we got pulled over by the police and had to try to explain. And again, in the early years, no one even heard of this coyote project or didn't even know that coyotes were in these areas. I mean, that was the other problem, is that these coyotes are so good at hiding and so good about avoiding people that a lot of these communities had no idea coyotes were there. So when an officer would pull us over, and we're telling them we're radio tracking coyotes, they would just give us this look, like, "What are you talking about? Like, we don't believe you." And we usually have these trucks with these big antennas coming off the top. That was also a big concern of the public. So if we did stop, like in a neighborhood, and we're sweeping this antenna around, and it's like 11 o'clock at night, I can guarantee you they were calling the police. So that happened a bunch. And now the reason the project is so well known that we don't get the police called on us much anymore. There were a couple times, I mean, we literally had to get out and we had to assume the position, and they had to go through our vehicle looking for any kind of firearms and things like that. So, and it really depended on the location where we were at. There's some places, if we were either in really, really rich areas, very exclusive areas, we would get called on quite a bit. Or if we were in very poor areas or in really rough areas, we would get called on. A lot of the suburbs in between, not so much. But we also had a few cases because that antenna was so obvious. I mean, it's a big antenna, off the front, the top of the truck. Is that on more than one occasion, and this is true, and it's not just me, some of the technicians have also experienced this as well, is when you're stopped at a stoplight in the traffic, in Chicago traffic can be pretty slow. I'm sure it's similar in Philadelphia, but so you're stopped there and someone is waving at you to roll down your window, and you roll it down, and they'll usually ask you, like, what are you tracking or something, but some of them think they're pretty funny and they would ask us, like, what TV station are we watching in the cab or something like that.
We've talked a lot about coyotes over the years in different ways and sort of how they've moved across the continent. And Philadelphia seems like the last place they got to. But Tony, you saw, what year was it that you saw your coyote in Spruce Street in Old City?
Yeah, this is funny because like Billy and I have been doing this podcast for 10 years, and this story comes up pretty, I'd say, at least once a year. And I feel like this is like finally the like episode where I get to really tell the story like in perfect context. So I'm assuming this was okay. So I think it was between 94. It had to be between 94 and 97, right? I'm pretty sure it was 94, between 94 and 97, because I was still living at my parents' house because I was walking up to the L. Although at that time of night, the L, we haven't. Chicago has an L too. You know, the elevated, the subways in Philly and also Chicago. Some of them go above ground. In fact, this one is actually above ground more than it's below ground, so that's why they call it the L, the elevated. And I was right downtown, like in the residential part of downtown, but still, this is a colonial house. It's very dense. I mean, you know, it's still very close to skyscrapers and huge, you know, hotels and everything. And I was walking up to catch the L shuttle because it was that late at night, and I remember I was like, wow, that's a cool looking dog. You know, this had to be 2 a.m. or something, you know, easy. And I was like, wow, it's a really cool looking dog. And I was like, where's his owner? And I was like, why is its tail between its legs? Why does it keep like looking over its shoulder and looking around? I was like, Dad, it's a coyote. And, you know, I've never seen one before, but, you know, because I think at that point, I mean, I might have been to Arizona, California when but I was a little kid. And, you know, when I went, I'd never seen a coyote before. And I was like, Dad, it's a coyote. And I went home and I mean, this is before the internet. So I went, you know, I've always been in nature and my parents are too. So I just went and like grabbed books and looked it up. And I was like, and I remember distinctly saying that, you know, they walk with their tails between their legs. And, you know, and I mean, it was a coyote for, you know, one thing. I mean, it definitely was a coyote, but I was like, it confirmed it. I was like, couldn't believe it. And, you know, I had heard that they've gotten out east at this point, but, you know, but again, there's no like, you know, didn't go on a message board and post like I saw a coyote, you know, and I mean, everybody believed me because I've been in, you know, I was always like the guy everybody knew like nature, so no one's gonna, you know, no one's doubting that I know what I was looking at, but yeah, that was so cool. It wasn't until I forget when I think I was just like out in California or something visiting friends, and you know. There's just like a coyote, like at Griffith Park or something, just like, you know, in Los Angeles or something. But I've seen, you know, a million of them since. But I have seen, you know, a few more in Philly since. But one was in a residential neighborhood, but in a very suburban. Well, actually, two, I guess, technically in residential neighborhoods. But one was a very residential neighborhood in not too far from a big park, but still like, you know, walking between like single houses. I saw one around the corner from my house, but I live right next. I live, even though I live in Philly, I live in a single house now, right next to a 19-acre park. But I saw it jumping between across a street, between like a little fragment of a park, and then like the main part, like, but it jumped, you know, right across the street. And then I seen one just like jumping across a road, but like leading to the park. And in the park, in that point, there's a border between Philly and the suburbs, and it was like an big old field, and then the park. And I think that's all I see. But Billy saw photographs like roadkill.
Yeah, we saw a dead one about 10 years ago. As a friend and I were going to go out more into reptiles and amphibians than anything else, and so we were heading out to go look for turtles or something. And so we were driving out, and we passed a dead coyote on the shoulder near the same park that Tony's talking about, the Wissahickon, which is this big, long, wooded ravine creek corridor park in northwest Philadelphia. And at the edge of that, in a golf course off the Walnut Lane Bridge. And it was one of those times where, like, my friend was driving, I was in the passenger seat. We both, like, had that, like I don't even know if we said anything. We just, like, immediately knew we had to do a U-turn and go back and get pictures of it. But yeah, it was a freshly road-killed coyote. There's no arguing with the dead thing sitting there on the road right next to you, you know? Sad as it is. But it's funny, though, like, when I read about your work and your research in Chicago, and even stuff, I guess, further out west, like in LA and whatnot, I feel like we don't have as dense a population of coyotes. And I say that knowing that everyone thinks they don't have as dense a population of coyotes as they actually do. But I've been trying real hard. I mean, like I was just today, Tony, we were in the Haddington Woods sections of Cobb's Creek. It's another one of these creek corridor parks. I have put cameras out there I have a few years ago we had a year of good snowfall, which we haven't had in a few years. And so I'd seen some tracks.
Mm.
I was like, man, I think that's a coyote. And I put a camera out there, and it ended up being some guy's husky that was like running off leash. And I don't know. I keep thinking I found the perfect spot for him, and I don't see him. And so I know it's a ridiculous question to ask. I was like, well, why don't we have as many coyotes? But I don't know. That doesn't seem like it's an answerable question. I'm just sitting here trying to figure it out.
Right. I mean, we can always make guesses, some educated guesses, but I definitely agree that there's definitely differences across cities in terms of what their coyote population looks like in terms of abundance and their distribution. So I have been able to work a little bit in some other cities, and that's one of the first things we noticed. Like, for example, Cleveland, we attempted to do a coyote study in Cleveland, and there was a small amount of work that was done there. But again, using my same people, myself, my techs, my grad students working in Chicago, we moved over to Cleveland using the same techniques and dramatically different results in terms of the number of animals we caught and that we could radio collar. Much lower density or much lower capture success, which I believe reflects their density. And the thing is that if you can radio collar them, one of the first things they do is they basically tell you through their data the size of their territories. They're so territorial that it gets actually drawn by the animals themselves, basically the boundaries. And so you can look at the size of the territory, and that is highly correlated with the density of your population. So when you have large territories, you have a low density. When you have really small territories, that means you've got a lot of coyotes. And so even by just radio collaring just a handful of animals, if they're resident animals, you begin to get a picture pretty quickly as to whether you're dealing with a lot of animals or whether you're dealing with a fairly small number.
So something that, I've got questions about interspecies relationships for later, but I've kind of used the apparent abundance of foxes and woodchucks as like a coyote indicator.
Yep.
Like if we're seeing a whole lot of foxes,
Yep.
there probably aren't resident coyotes there.
Right.
And if there's tons of woodchucks around, there's probably not a lot of coyotes there. You're nodding, so it's fair.
100%. You're 100%. I mean, we don't have any publications that I can point to that our experience is definitely supports that. So in fact, in Chicago, again, I was working on other species. I was already there. Woodchucks and foxes were very common in the areas where I was working. So we would see them all the time. In fact, I was studying raccoons at the time, and I would catch woodchucks or groundhogs all the time in the traps because there were so many. That was in the mid 1990s, and we get toward the late 90s. That's when all of a sudden the coyotes are beginning to pop up. By the early 2000s, the foxes are out of the system altogether, and so are the woodchucks. I mean, the woodchucks are just disappearing left and right, much to the delight of the cemetery managers and the golf course managers and that type of thing.
You mentioned they're all people who hate woodchucks.
I think they're cute, and they make the best noises ever. But I think that the coyotes definitely impact them.
Tony, I got 100 questions. I'm going to force myself to stop. Do you have anything you want to ask?
We were talking about this while we're getting audio set up. I guess this is a good place to talk about it because you're talking about the territory size and how territorial they are. And I know so we're talking about mange, and you've done some work and published some stuff about cats, and I know you did studies. So I'm curious about and we're going to talk now, like we haven't talked about this yet. What do you see as the likelihood of feral cat feeding stations as being a place where mange can be spread either from cats to other animals or other animals, or even just within species. Like is that seems to me like a very logical place that this would be. Because are there other resources that animals from different territories, different packs, whatever, would use regularly enough to spread between, or how else would it spread? I guess I mean, obviously you don't want to inbreed, so some have to leave and join other packs or whatever, and maybe that's where they get it from. But I guess the question is mange more common, more prevalent in urban coyotes, and what's the likelihood they're gonna get cat feeding stations?
Yeah, so mange is a really important disease for coyotes and for canids in general. Canids being the dog species or the members of the dog family. So wolves, coyotes, and foxes, both red and gray foxes, they all are important hosts for sarcoptic mange, and that's a particularly devastating mange. It's easily spread across individuals in that group. What's interesting is that even though other species can also be infected by it, they are not hosts for this, except for some reason, squirrels can be a host for sarcoptic mange, and some of the cats can do that. But many of the others, like raccoons and even our domestic cats, not so much. So that's the background behind mange. And what we found, and the way it works in rural coyote populations and foxes and even in wolves, is that it's generally considered to be a density-dependent disease. What I mean by that is you tend to see sarcoptic mange really rearing its head in the population when the population's at a high density. It's easy to be spread among individuals at that point. So that's when you see a big outbreak of mange. And then as animals die, the population goes down, the territories get bigger, and there's more space between individuals. And so the disease tends to drop out. So that's in a rural situation. In fact, they believe that it cycles in rural populations. So in the early years, so by the fourth year of our study, back in 2004, we began seeing mange pop up in the coyote population. And so we assumed that it would be a regulatory mechanism. It would actually control the coyote population in the Chicago area. Especially they were showing signs of really getting to a high density. So we assumed it would work the same way it works out in the rural system. And that it should increase their mortality rate, coyotes should die off, and so will the disease. But it did not work out that way, and it still hasn't. To this day, what's happened is that it works completely different, at least in the Chicago population, in which it doesn't cycle. There's a small percentage of coyotes that are always kind of infected with mange, and it doesn't get above around 15 to 20% of the population. Usually it's less than 10%, and it's just stayed like that from year to year to year. So it operates completely differently in the system, and it's not regulating the coyote population. It's not a high enough mortality rate to actually limit their population growth. In fact, we haven't found a disease yet that is potentially regulating the coyote population.
So that so there's a question we always, podcast listeners will know, have heard us talk about this kind of thing, but does that have to do with the nature of the disease, or just that the coyotes there are that much more fecund, or they're absorbing immigration from the surrounding landscape? Like, is that a question of the disease or question of sort of the population dynamics of the coyotes within the urban setting?
Yeah, right. So those are all great questions, and I don't have the answer for you. So that's actually one of the things that we've been looking at. It's something that it takes many years on a disease dynamic like that to try to answer or tease apart, like, how is it actually functioning? I mean, our gut feeling is that this population has a certain level of resistance to mange that doesn't occur in a rural population where animals die and drop out, and then it starts all over again. In this case, most of these animals have been exposed to it and just didn't develop the disease. So how that's working, we don't really know. Our minds got blown when we finally used a serology test, like a blood test, to determine whether or not these animals have been exposed to it. And virtually almost 100% of them were positive for mange. And yet, again, only about 10% or so. It fluctuates a little bit from year to year. It only fluctuates from about 5 to 15 to 18% in a big year. And yet almost 100% of them are positive for having been exposed to the disease. So that's an indicator that, there's some resistance going on, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to perhaps explore whether or not there's a genetic aspect to that resistance. So we are doing genetic analyses on these animals, and that's one of the things we're really interested in, is if we're maybe creating a kind of a really strong animal in an urban system. The same thing's happening with distemper and parvo, canine parvovirus. They're really high seropositive rates, and yet very little mortality to those diseases.
So something that you get into in the book about the some differences that you see between the population dynamics of rural versus urban coyotes, and gets into the question we often ask about source or sink in an urban setting for a wildlife species. That you're seeing the coyotes have really big litters. They seem like healthy animals. So it sounds like the city is not just a black hole for coyotes, that they're actually, you're shaking your head. So go ahead, run with that. Yep.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that was one of the original questions when we started the study way back in 2000. Is like, are these animals that are showing up in Chicago, is it just a sink? So they're basically just finding their way into the city, and it's an accident, it's a mistake. They're either young, or they're sick, or they're not going to survive very long. So, it's not a sustaining population. That's what we expected. That was our initial hypotheses. And we definitely felt like there were certain large sections of the Chicago metro area that would never be able to host coyotes. I mean, coyotes would not be able to sustain themselves in those areas. Just too developed, too urban, and coyotes have no business living in those areas. That was what we thought. And now, I mean, it's very obvious. I mean, we were able to answer that question relatively early in the study, which is, high reproductive rate, high survival compared to rural areas. They're in great physical condition. And so they are definitely, it's a source population. The population growth rate is definitely on the positive side. And so they're actually creating excess numbers of coyotes that are now moving out into the country or moving into other cities, such as Milwaukee.
What do you mean by that? Like, how does Chicago, assuming that there's coyotes living in the suburbs and in rural areas, how are the urban ones in particular getting to like Milwaukee? Is it just that it's so urban in between that it's just nonstop city and suburb?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of it's developed, but there's also agricultural areas in between those particular metro areas as well. So there's a mix of different landscape types, but I mean, what we found is that basically it didn't start out this way, but eventually coyotes were able to colonize all different parts of the Chicago area. In fact, there are a couple of black holes. There actually are a couple of sinks within the Chicago metro area. Most of it's all positive. Most of it's all source. The sinks are the airports. So the airports are sinks. And I call them black holes because they're also like prime habitat to a coyote. A coyote looks across the fence at O'Hare or Midway, and they see these massive areas of grassland out there, which is the coyote's favorite habitat type. and they can't resist. They get sucked in there, and then you have people that with guns that shoot them. So they get killed pretty quickly when they go in there. So with those exceptions, all the other parts of the Chicago area are pretty much all positive growth rate. So they produce excess animals, and so those transients are going to move across first the Chicago metro area for any kind of vacancies, and occasionally there are. So even though it can be totally saturated, you have a resident animal that gets hit by a car or has another type of accident and is gone, then a transient is able. It's all about timing. They're able to slide right in and take that spot. But if there isn't a place that opens up, they eventually find their way outside of the metro area. They find themselves out in the country, which is also still occupied by coyotes. They're just simply looking for a vacancy at the right time. Yeah. And until they find that, they're going to keep moving along. That's how they end up in other places. Or in a lot of cases, they're killed while they're making that long journey. So especially when our urban coyotes end up over in the country, in the rural areas, they're highly vulnerable to hunting and trapping.
Tony, what are you sharing there? I can't quite read it.
I just think it's hilarious. It's literally from my book, and is a picture of an illustration of a coyote and a snowy owl at an airport, because I talk about how airports are great places to go look for coyotes and snowy owls. So I just thought it was too. I literally was working on this earlier today. I thought it was too hilarious not to share, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm vindicated. I am correct."
Yeah, yep. Awesome. And I remember, this is funny. This with the coyotes now. That when I was growing up, which was in the 80s and early into the 90s in Columbus, Ohio, that I think the coyotes weren't a problem in the airport, but the bane of, I think, the airport manager's existence were the woodchucks, because they would dig up and they would mess with the runway light wiring when they were digging, and so there was a constant battle for the airport folks against the woodchucks. You have a funny nuisance animal like ecology there between all these things that coyotes eat and then the coyotes themselves. Hey, something that clearly, I feel like I picked up on it in the book a little bit, that I think annoys you, but I'll probably a lot of people are going to wonder about this, is once you get out east, how coyote are our coyotes and how wolf are our coyotes?
Yeah, so that's the coy wolf thing.
Yeah,
the term that I really hate.
Yeah, I thought that was, I mean, I definitely wrote in the chat to talk about it, but I was under the impression that's been kind of debunked. But
it has, but that's for most of us, but there's a minority. So there's a handful of people that still kind of cling to that and still think that that's a good descriptor. And then the media, and this is not the media's fault, by the way, but the media definitely, they do their Google searches or whatever, and they run across coy wolf. It's still out there. And until they quit writing about it, it's still going to be out there. And but they'll keep writing about it because it's still out there. So it just feeds. It's just this cycle. It's not ever going to go away.
All right. We'll brush right past that one.
Well, but wait, but where did it come? I mean, there is a little bit of DNA in there from dogs and wolves, but how much? And is it?
Right.
And aren't there some evidence to suggest that the coyotes out east are a bit larger and more probably more. Well, I don't know, probably more, but they're more variety in their pelage color than out west. Is that at all something that's been bearing?
There's truth in that for sure. So it is true that the coyotes toward the east, so especially east of the Mississippi, but actually as you get closer to the northeast, and in some cases, depending on which hybrid you're talking about, a little bit to the southeast, they do have a higher degree of dog or wolf gene in them. So and when we're talking about a higher proportion, we're still talking about 10% on average. It may vary a little bit. Our coyotes here in Ohio or Illinois, the wolf part of their genome is about 1%, or like slightly less than 1%, but the dog part of it could be up to 5%. You go farther to the east, and those percentages tend to go up. When you go to the southeast, the dog percentage goes up, wolf doesn't. Wolf percentage stays down. You go to the northeast, especially when you get up to the Canadian line, then the wolf percentage goes up to something greater than 10%, but the dog part of it stays down relatively low. So that's kind of how it's fluctuating. Physically, what does that mean? So physically, the coyotes to the far northeast with the highest degree of wolf DNA, so again, getting closer to like 15%, they are physically larger than coyotes in the Midwest, and especially physically larger than coyotes in the Southwest. So the smallest coyotes you have are the ones in the Southwest. They're little dinky things. The ones that in the Midwest, like for example, our Chicago coyotes are actually pretty decent size. And they're not a whole lot smaller than your coy wolves, the ones that are up there in the far northeast. But the far northeast are the ones that are the largest on average. So when I say they're the largest, what does that mean? It means that they're based on data that we have, and I actually did a study of wolves, of coyotes in Nova Scotia. So that's your northeastern coyotes. They're averaging about 5 pounds heavier than say our Chicago animals. So 5 pounds heavier. That's an average.
12%.
One of the smallest coyotes I've ever caught was one of those Nova Scotia animals. In fact, I picked it up out of the trap by hand. It was so small, and I pointed it to the parks biologist was with me, and we had joked around about the coy wolf thing, and I said, I'm literally holding this adult female, and I said, this is your coy wolf. This is this is all you got. So anyway, so it's more complex than what the media, than that picture. When you say coy wolf, people think it's a 1-to-1, like what we call an F1 hybrid, 50-50, and that's why they're so much bigger, and that's why they act more like wolves. Well, that's not true. So they're definitely, they look a lot more like coyotes, and they are functionally coyotes.
What happens in the further north of the range? I'm wondering is the size differences you're talking about, is that a factor of wolf genetics or just a factor of there's a term you hear, Bergman's rule, the tendency of animals is to get further north to be larger. Are we seeing, is that all we're seeing? Just that they're just northern animals, so they're a little bigger?
So that's actually been proposed as well. And so that could also be playing a role. However, the animals to the eastern north, so the eastern provinces are larger than the coyotes to the west on the western provinces. So same latitude north, but the western coyotes are just slightly smaller than ones to the east. But again, the difference is, like, I don't think if you just randomly selected an individual from one to the other, from one population or the other, you wouldn't necessarily know which region that you're pulling from. That's me, and there's going to be other people that would argue the opposite. But that's also my own personal experience. Again, there is a statistically significant difference in their size, but it's slight. And more importantly, we didn't ever notice anything different about them in terms of how they're functioning out there, in terms of their behavior. Pack sizes are the same as what you'd find for coyotes, not wolves. And their diets are more similar to, they are coyotes. So they're a coyote diet, but highly flexible. So, in fact, that Nova Scotia group, that population I was studying, we actually documented that population living off of moose. So that's the largest prey.
I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's moose, but I sincerely believe our Chicago coyotes, that if they were dropped down from a helicopter on the same study area, they would be doing the same thing because they're so opportunistic, and that's all they had available to them.
Oh, okay. So, gosh, I'll throw another hot button topic at you, which would be more in rural areas. But one of the things that jumped out at me when I was getting towards, I guess I forget it's a whole chapter, but your section on sort of interspecies relationships. The predation rates on fawns for white-tailed deer was blowing my mind. Like more than 50%, or 50% on average, but like sometimes upwards of that, like 80%.
80 something percent.
Of fawns are getting taken out by coyotes. Whereas if you're in rural PA, like if you want to start a fight in a diner, I imagine you start talking about this question of coyotes and are they eating deer? And so, yeah, it seems like you're on a little bit of a tightrope there rhetorically if you're in the city saying, hey guys, we're eating all the deer. But then if you go back to Kansas and you say, hey guys, we're eating all the deer. Like,
or Ohio.
Or Ohio.
Ohio, they want bounties on coyotes because the deer hunters, they want bounties because they think that they're impacting the deer population. And yet the deer population, every other measure suggests that the deer are fine. The population is not going down. I'm sure Pennsylvania is the same way. In most cases, the state agencies are trying to get hunters to take more deer. So that's the discontinuity is actually on that side. It's not that much of a tightrope. I understand totally what you're saying, and definitely the deer hunters pick up on that those results, and they kind of use them for their arguments. But we're talking about urban deer populations here, and their deer densities in these areas, especially the areas where we're looking at the fawn predation, are off the charts high. And so they kind of promote their own predation by, when you have an overabundant deer population, often they eat the browse or the vegetation, and they actually in some ways kind of facilitate the predation of the fawns. So it's a little different in the urban settings, and it's very difficult to hunt those populations or to use the standard technique. So they're having to use sharpshooting and that type of thing. So the coyote predation of the fawns is actually very beneficial. It's beneficial for us. It's beneficial for the plant communities, and it's also beneficial for the deer because they're a prey animal, and their system, the reproductive system, is built to have a certain level of predation take place. When you don't have any predation taking place and you have a really high fawn survival rate, you have too many deer. And in fact, it's going to impact them to a certain degree. So that high fawn predation rate is generally a good thing. And in fact, I think it's kind of important. I don't know how it comes across in the book, but it struck me after we've done this now, the fawn survival stuff, for about 7 years now. And at some point during those 7 years, it dawned on me that by taking those fawns, coyotes are reducing our risk to the most dangerous animal to us that's in that urban ecosystem, and that would be deer. Deer actually injure more people than any other wildlife species, and it's through, of course, deer auto collision. And in fact, unfortunately, we've had people killed with collisions with deer in our study areas. So it's a real thing that's out there, and it's always sad for us to actually observe the fawn predation. Fawns are like the cutest things ever out there.
I don't know. I saw a coyote pup in the Poconos that might have been the cutest animal I've ever seen in my life. It was like yelling at me. It was like, it was the cutest.
That's true. The coyote pups are right there too. They're all cute, but it's hard to visualize that cute little fawn could be an animal that ends up killing someone later.
Yeah.
But that's actually, so when people are worried about the risks of having coyotes around them, this is one thing that they don't see and they don't appreciate, and we didn't appreciate it either. until we could actually document it, is that in some ways, coyotes are helping to reduce some of the risks that we face from wildlife in the city.
But they're not eating
Lyme
the
disease probably
raccoons.
too. Their impact on that.
Yeah, so for Lyme disease, they're probably playing a role to help control that. So Lyme disease would be that bacteria that is actually transmitted through ticks, deer ticks that are hosted by either deer or, most importantly, rodents. So coyotes are eating rodents and they're eating the deer. So in both cases, they're focusing on those host species that help to maintain the Lyme disease in your parks.
I got something I've been trying to sort out, because I've read stuff recently that changed my previous conception of this, and this is not the focus of your research. So I'm throwing something at you that's not, I don't think is in your wheelhouse, but let's see. The question of how much do predators actually regulate the populations of their prey species. So you've got like the classic textbook thing of like, your rabbits and foxes, and, the population of one determines the other, and that, they sort of this relationship back and forth. And then you've got sort of, people love to talk about wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone as an example of this with the elk. And then you've got folks saying, well, actually that was way overstated. And and we had a guest on the podcast about a year ago, I think, maybe, Bernd Blassi from Cornell, who wrote a paper about sort of arguing that that sort of folks on both sides might not have this right. That he's supposed to talk about wolves and deer family animals, that wolves aren't going to eat all the deer and ruin things for hunters, and neither are they going to knock the populations back as much as the people who adore wolves might want them to. But then we're talking about this, and we've got the one case where are they eating enough fawns to change the net population of deer? But then we were also saying that they seem to be eating enough woodchucks to change the population of woodchucks. So just talk a little bit about this relationship between, because what you study is the coyotes, but the relationship between the population levels of the prey animals, their prey species.
Right. Yeah. So the relationship between the predator and the prey is usually more complex than what we think, and that's because we're usually operating in an open system. So if we just take the coyote and the predation rate on the fawns, if we just look at that we just talked about, deer hunters would say there's a direct relationship. And it's a one-to-one kind of thing. So you have an increase in predators, you have an increase in predation on the fawns, and it's a simple system, and there's a consequence for having every predator for every deer, and so that's one way to look at it. But what we found, again, even though when we were talking about those high predation rates, they fluctuated from year to year, and there are other factors that are involved in that relationship between the predator and the prey. So the most important one being alternative prey. So when there's a lot of alternative prey, such as voles, that's the coyote's favorite dietary item. What we found is that when the vole population is exploding, and it's very common, then coyotes are actually pretty slow to switch from voles to fawns. So they have to switch because fawns are not available year round. And so at some point, something's got to cause the coyote to switch from more of their year-round prey, which would be rabbits or voles or something like that, to fawns when they're only available temporarily. By the way, I didn't point out that coyote predation on those fawns, that all takes place in the first 3 weeks of the fawn's life. So after they get to be about 4 weeks old or older, then the risk of coyote predation goes down to almost zero. So it's a very short window where coyotes have to exert their pressure on them. So something could happen either in terms of if you have an abundant alternative prey, rabbits or voles, then they're slow to make that switch. and that's when their predation rate actually goes down. The same thing could also happen with regard to weather. So weather can influence their predation rate as well. And so habitat conditions. So if you have a good year, maybe there's a drought, maybe there's not a drought, maybe it's a full flush year, that influences the predation rate as well. So there are other factors at play that vary that pressure on the deer population. So the other thing I would mention is that even though their predation rate is fairly high, and that's definitely having an impact on the growth rate of the deer population, it doesn't lower their numbers. So that's because they have almost no impact on the survival rate of the adults. And in fact, I mentioned even of fawns, if the fawns make it through that first month of life, coyotes have almost no impact on fawn survival either. So they're not having as much of an impact on the overall deer population, but they are having an impact on the population growth. But I do agree that it's really hard to document how much regulation predation takes is responsible for on prey items.
Well, because any prey item is going to have multiple predators, and any predator is going to have multiple.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a real tightly linked binary for. I guess that's be easy to tease out. I'm just also, part of me is just like amazed that you've got this animal that can survive on voles or on moose. You know.
Yep. Yep.
So what's the diet of the? What are you seeing in the coyotes that are in the most built environment, right? With the least natural vegetation. What's their diet there?
Right. So that's a great question. For the first 10 years of the study, a lot of our work and effort was involved in the suburbs. And then we knew that the coyotes were able to colonize what you're talking about, the most urban part, what we call the urban core. That's completely developed, very little green space. And we know that they were able to do it. We were getting reports and they were showing up on security cameras. So we made an effort to move into that area, which is really hard to do, to try and trap coyotes and radio collar them and to try and figure out if that's a source or a sink or whatever. And so sure enough, it's still a source. But the diet was one of the things we were most curious about, because we figured the only way coyotes could be able to live in that environment would be to live off of our food, basically our trash. We just assume that they probably aren't functioning like predators like they are out in the suburbs, but they're now acting like garbage dumpster divers, or that kind of thing, like raccoons in most cases. So that was our operating assumption. And so what we do to look at the diet, so first of all, you can't use the standard technique of picking up scats or their poop and looking at that. That's the typical old school dietary study of coyotes, because coyotes lay their scats out where anyone can see them because they use that for marking. But that doesn't work in the city, in the areas that you're talking about, Tony, because scats don't persist on sidewalks and roads and that type of thing. So, and also because our focus was really on like how much human food was in their diet, that doesn't show up in their feces very well either. So if you think about our own feces and you're trying to identify someone's diet based on their fecal matter, that's really hard to do. So we figured we were probably missing the diet, that aspect of the diet, even for the suburban animals. So what we do is we collect a whisker from each coyote that we capture, and we snip the whisker, and then we section that whisker into different sections. We can analyze that whisker using the thing called stable isotopes, and that just breaks it down chemically. And we look at carbon and nitrogen isotopes that all biological organisms have. It turns out that in many cases, diet items, not all cases, but many cases, prey items or other diet items such as fruit or our trash, that type of thing, human foods, have signatures that are carried into the animal's tissue when they consume those items. And so you can, by looking at things such as their hair or their blood or their muscle tissue, you can actually begin to identify what proportion of these different diet items were in their diet when that tissue was formed. So in the case of whiskers, when the whisker is grown, that diet during that growth period is reflected in the whisker. And so it turns out that technique is really good at separating human-based foods from natural-based foods for coyotes. And that was what we wanted to look at. And so it turns out that when we do that with these coyotes, it was really exciting because this is like the very first full profile of an urban coyote population of known individuals. You know their sex, their age, you know their social status, you know where they live. What does their diet look like? And what we found was that it's highly variable, that coyotes are not all using the same strategies. They're using many different strategies in terms of their diet, and even members of the same pack living in the same territory may be using different diet items. So we saw a lot of variability. The majority of the population is eating natural food. The minority is eating human foods. As you move into the city, getting to your question, the most urban core animals, we thought they would be the ones that would be having the high human-based diet, but they didn't. They showed the same degree of variation among individuals that we were seeing out in the suburbs. A slight majority of them are eating natural foods, even in the urban core, and then the minority are eating human-based foods. And there are some coyotes, roughly about 20%, that have the same diet that you and I have. So they're eating hamburgers and French fries and donuts and all that stuff. But the rest of them, a lot of them have a mix. So they're mixing and matching human food with the native diet or natural diet. And then you have, again, over 50% of the population, well over 50%, eating 80% or greater natural foods.
Now, the natural foods, could you tell the species composition? Are they going from eating voles and fawns to eating brown rats and squirrels and pigeons, or is it like? Can you tell that from stable isotopes? Or
we can tell. We can distinguish some of those prey items. We can't distinguish all of them. So we can distinguish voles from some other animals. Rabbits actually are really big urban natural diet item. So it turns out rabbits are really common in the downtown area or along Lakeshore Drive, or both on the north side and the south side. Really common. So they're taking advantage of the rabbits. So we could identify rabbits, we can identify deer, we can identify a few other natural type items, squirrels, or deviate. They separate out somewhat as well. So it turns out, just so you know, the reason why the human foods separate out from those prey items is that our human-based foods, and this includes dog food and other things, it's all corn-based. Right. So and corn has a very particular signature in carbon. It's what we call C4. So it's very different from the plants in the carbon for other plants that occur there naturally. So the C4 really separates out. So that's why we can't identify like what kind of human foods it is. We just know that these coyotes are way off over on this other side, and it's because of that C4, and that's what separates them out.
But they're not eating rats. That's something that like really surprised me in the book.
Right. So rats actually do separate out quite a bit, so they're easy to identify. But yeah, there's very few coyotes. In fact, maybe one or two that have been consuming rats. Very rare. Right.
So I just want to share a quick anecdote. It's going to circle back to coyotes, though. Trust me. You talk about stable isotopes. this is in May, it'll be 20 years since was a field tech up in a snow goose study up in the Canadian Arctic in Wapas National Park. And one of the things they're doing was stable isotopes to see, because the snow geese population has exploded because of corn, because they're eating corn in the Midwest. They're coming back. Their survival, so they're trying to, because the area's so vast, they're trying to see if you can tell how they've changed their diet, because they're moving farther away from the coast, more inland. Right. So I was up there, literally, I was helping package, samples of tissue for stable isotopes. Now, the PI, Robert Rockwell at M&H and also CUNY in New York City, one of his graduate students was studying coyotes and using DNA from hair they would find and from scat to determine the population size of areas. Turns out, where we worked up in the Arctic, it's literally the densest polar bear population in the world. And it's funny, when I remember him saying, one of the polar bear researchers that they were going to do say that you guys are nuts, because the polar bear researchers like stay back at town, get in a helicopter, fly out, dart a bear, maybe land and do some ground observations. But it's like, you guys are on the ground all day, every day with polar bears. Like, they're trying to raid our camp, whatever. So now Rocky has switched to studying polar bears, because he's studied geese for 50 years. He went up trying to study their genetics to see, if the blue or snow were blue versus white were actually separate species, realized they're the same. Switched to the trophic cascade of the whole, overpopulation. But now he studies almost exclusively polar bears, because he's on the ground and he built an infrastructure that has the most access to polar bear hair and scat and that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for a graduate student studying coyotes in New York City. So,
wow,
we're near New York. Yeah, so it's funny how it's all related.
Wow, that's amazing. So I will say that the New York City, the people over there also presented published some dietary stuff for their coyotes there, using metabar coding, so it's genetic stuff as opposed to isotopes. But they also found a similar result, which was that rats didn't make up much of their diet at all. So even over in New York City, it's not happening. So it does seem to be a thing. We'll see over time if that still continues. But there's definitely a benefit to the coyotes not consuming the rats, at least in Chicago, and that's because of rodenticide. So, the rats are a major problem, as they are in most cities. In Chicago, it varies somewhat from year to year, but they do have programs where they're constantly putting out poisons to try and reduce the rat population, which would then potentially, jeopardize coyotes and other animals.
And it's so frustrating, because we all know that the best way to control rats is sanitation, not poison.
Yeah.
Sanitation. That also helps control coyote numbers too. So there wouldn't be quite as many coyotes running around there. Coyotes are only going to live where there's food. So if there's no food, they're going to move on. They won't try and live there. So, but unfortunately, we do have some examples of people actually feeding people. So Tony, you were asking about like the potential, species transfer of diseases, that type of thing, going back to that. And you're pointing to cat colonies as a potential source. We've done some research on that, but there's also other focal points of trash or sanitation issues, and that also has an impact of basically concentrating animals together that would not normally be in contact with each other. And in fact, we've actually observed coyotes in areas with raccoons and skunks and that type of thing. And they would not normally be sharing that space if it wasn't because the food was allowing them to do that.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about outdoor cats, but one of the downsides of feeding outdoor cats and leaving food out is just what you're talking about. Humans are more concerned about rabies than we are about mange.
Especially in the East. where you guys are. So and that's a big issue, and it's because of raccoon strain rabies is the big issue in the East, and that also happens to be a strain of the rabies that easily spills over into coyotes. And so some of the really um, dramatic examples of coyotes actually attacking people just out of the blue and hurting people. I mean, pretty serious attacks have been rabid coyotes that were infected with raccoon strain rabies. And those, of course, are only located along the eastern part of the U.S.
And I just realized, I just looked at the time. I've been having a great time talking, but we're keeping you up in your, what looks like your office, and or conference room. I'm not sure, but why don't we? I don't know, Tony. I was going to wind up and say, just ask about that last question you're touching on. I mean, people often end up scared of coyotes. I sort of lump them, and I think of them like I think of even Tony. You know what I'm talking about, like with black bears or something like that, which can look scary, but as soon as you get close to them, they run away. You've been involved in studying coyotes in just as a animal research subject in general, and their ecology and whatnot, but also I'm guessing what brought you to Nova Scotia was the very tragic death of the hiker up there.
So coyotes do occasionally attack people. So that's a fact. It's rare, very rare. It's even more rare for them to attack someone. And when I mean attack, I'm actually talking about physically biting someone. Because you're right, the term attack gets confused and it becomes very gray. In especially for people that are scared, that are legit. I mean, they're truly scared and intimidated by coyotes encountering them. They consider an attack to be simply, in some cases, a coyote looking at them the wrong way. So I'm talking specifically about when people are bitten by a coyote, and it has happened. It's going to happen again at some point. It's rare that it's serious, especially for adults. And so, Bill, you were mentioning Nova Scotia. That was a very rare circumstance. The only case of a human fatality, of an adult human fatality, due to a coyote attack. Still, that was in 2009. So that was over a decade ago, and that's still the case. So fortunately, there have been no more cases like that. But when it happened, it certainly created a stir, and there were a lot of people contacting me, including agency folks that are asking me, well, does this change everything? I mean, this is now, do we need to start putting more fear into people or telling them that we can't tolerate having coyotes near people? And the answer at that time was like, I don't know, because this had never happened before. So we had to, I mean, we thought it was going to be a unique case. We were hoping it would be, and that's been the case. Even up there, it's turned into a rare event. So it doesn't happen very frequently, where you do have to be concerned a little bit about coyote attacks on people is when you're talking about children. And so, fortunately, there's only been one child fatality, a child under 5 years of age due to a coyote attack. However, there have been other attacks of children. And in this case, those are easily, I'd say most of those cases, they were easily predicted because the coyotes were being fed by people. There was a case, or at least it's pretty well documented, that feeding is taking place, and their behavior was changing over time in terms of losing their fear of people. And so it could have been prevented. Unfortunately, that fatality, that was back in 1981. This is when it was over in LA, or the LA area. And so no one really knew that coyotes could pose any kind of a danger to children. And that was a community that was actively feeding the coyotes in the neighborhood. And they have been doing it for a long time. And in fact, the coyotes had lost their fear of people, and they thought it was cute or it was good to do that, and that was the consequence. And so now we know better, and now we try to get the message out. So again, we were talking about food being an issue. Food actually dictates a lot of the relationship between ourselves and coyotes. And often it's food that precipitates conflicts between them, including losing their fear of us. So that's one of the biggest issues. But you're right; it's very frustrating when people refer to a curious coyote or even a bold coyote. A lot of people confuse boldness with aggression, and those two are not the same thing. So you can have a bold coyote living somewhere, and in fact, we would argue, based on some early results that we have on personalities, is that in urban settings, coyotes have to be bold to a certain degree to be able to live in some of the areas where they live. But bold just means, in many cases, is just simply being willing to investigate a new area, or it may be willing to investigate or take advantage of a new food, or crossing a road that has some danger posed to them. That's a boldness. It's not attacking people, and it's not attacking pets. So there is a difference between bold and aggressive.
Yeah, just people, because they have a mouthful of teeth, that, if they're bold, they're scared. But like squirrels are very bold.
Yeah, they are.
Like
Geese.
yeah,
Geese are so bold.
I had a run-in with a pack of coyotes in Arizona that was, I was like, well, I know that they're not, I shouldn't be concerned, but I was out birding in southeast Arizona. It was kind of a wooded area, and we turned a trail, and we were like almost right in amongst a pack of coyotes, and we were closer to the coyotes than to some other members of the group. We were like, I mean, if we wanted to, we could probably walk right up on them, but they were fired up about something. I think they were like yipping and yelling, and they were like all looking in a direction, and they seemed like they were really wound up. And I think they were just so focused on whatever that was that they just didn't really care about us. And we just kind of turned a corner, like right there, and they were just like, they would like kind of look at us a little bit, like, but they would like turn, and it was crazy to be that close to a whole pack of coyotes. Like there was like, I don't know, over 10 probably. And I was wondering, like, is there a mat line over there? Like, what has gotten them so worked up? Like what are they freaked out about that they don't even care about us? But they're like, what's scarier than a whole bunch of people right now? To these coyotes, that they're so freaked out and looking, like. So like, I like to believe there's a mountain lion right there. I don't know, maybe they don't particularly. I mean, I'm trying to think what got them so worked up. But it was really cool. But it was unnerving a bit to be like so. I mean, because I'm a big guy and everything, but like, I don't think I could. I think one coyote would be a handful. I think I'd fight it off, but like a whole pack, I don't know. They take down moose in Nova Scotia, it might take me down. But there's a whole big pack of them. It was cool.
Yeah, no, and especially with especially their howling. I mean, when they do group howls, I totally understand why, especially suburbanites get a little nervous about that, because it can be pretty intimidating. But it's usually pretty something benign. I mean, they may have seen a long lost family member or something. It could be something as simple as that.
Yeah, it was a really cool experience though. Yeah, I love them though. Every time I get to see one.
Right. They are amazing animals, and we've been very fortunate to be able to do this kind of a study. You don't get to do like a 23 year studies very often. So very, very fortunate to have funding agencies willing to support that kind of research and allow us to explore some of these questions that can't be answered in 1 or 2 years. And so that's kind of what the book is supposed to be about, is just sharing some of the things that, even in that, I mean, we were limited in terms of the publishers limited us in terms of what we could share. So we had to keep it to a decent length, but there's just so many things that we've learned about them. Like we haven't even talked about things like their mating system. I mean, that's like to me one of the most fascinating aspects. That's a mystery to me is like how do coyotes pick their mate, the animal that they will more than likely only reproduce with in their life. That's a pretty big decision for a wild animal to make, and yet that's another thing that came out of this work that was totally unplanned, and
Really, Tinder,
it's kind of consumed my mind over the last 10 years.
Bumble.
What's that?
I'm saying what you found that was that they were using Wi-Fi and they were using like Tinder and Bumble, right?
Bumble.
And
Bumble. So Bumble, that's a dating thing, right? Is that
Yeah.
what that is?
yeah,
Okay, I can't acknowledge that stuff. Okay, real quick. So the we talked about the canid family. So that's the wolves, coyotes, and foxes. One of the things that makes it unique relative to other mammals is that they are all supposed to be monogamous. So that is not a typical mating system in mammals. Not typical at all, but it is in the canid family. But when geneticists start testing the offspring of monogamous pairs, usually they find a lot of examples of cheating going on. In fact, that's a pretty standard thing. They definitely found that with birds. So in the bird world, monogamy is the standard. That's the rule. Most birds are monogamous, but when they genetically tested them, they found all kinds of cheating going on. So there's a thing called behavioral monogamy, but then there's genetic monogamy. So behavioral monogamy can happen, genetic monogamy not so much. Well, wolves are not genetically monogamous. They cheat quite a bit. Foxes are off the chart cheaters. So they cheat like crazy. So most fox litters are coming from more than one pair of parents, or at least an extra parent. We expected to see the same thing happen with coyotes, but no one has actually ever genetically tested coyote populations for their mating success. And so we expected with our high densities and little territories and a lot of neighbors, there would be a lot of cheating going on, especially since coyotes are supposed to be so adaptable and flexible in their behavior. But we found the opposite, which was after 17 years, I forget, I think it's almost 70 to 80 litters that we tested with their parents. We have not documented a single case of cheating among those pairs. And not only that, so that's monogamy, genetic monogamy, but not only that, is that because of the length of our study, we're able to follow these pairs through time. And so we could find that they're not just monogamous within a year, but they're monogamous across years. And in fact, we've never documented a divorce. So they only take on another mate if their current mate dies.
so
That's
even
it.
if they're
So it is true lifetime monogamy.
so even if that pair is not having success, they'll still stay together even though they're
Yep.
not.
Yep, absolutely. And we've had some pretty strange pairings. So most of the pairs are unrelated. So they're the only members of their coyote pack that actually are not related to each other are the breeding pair. But there have been a couple of exceptions to that. So they can't recognize relatedness beyond their own offspring or their own siblings. So if you get individuals that came from different litters, same parents, but were born in different years, they disperse and they just randomly find each other. They will not recognize the fact that they're related, and so they can. So we do have just a couple of examples of mated pairs actually being related to each other, but these were individuals that left their original parents and rejoined. We did have a weird case of a grandson hooking up with his grandmother when she was quite old and she was not really able to produce much in the way of pups, and yet he would not leave her at all. This young stud would not give up on his mate because that was the mate that he settled on, was this old female. So no, and in fact, some studies have tried sterilization as a way to reduce, let's say, lamb predation. So sterilizing your resident animals so that they're not producing pups could reduce predation on livestock, and they found it highly successful. And the key to that was that the pairs have to maintain their bonds. So if you sterilize them and all of a sudden they give up on their mate, then that wouldn't be an effective strategy. The key to the effectiveness of that sterilization is that these animals still maintain their bonds even if they're not producing pups at all. And that's what they found.
Wow.
Yeah, super tight. I mean, super tight mating bonds. The other thing that's really remarkable about them is that they only mate during a very narrow window. In fact, right now in the middle of February is the peak of their mating. In just a few weeks before, a few weeks after, they will not be in breeding condition. Their hormone levels are going to drop. So for the rest of the year, they can't mate. I mean, they cannot produce offspring even if they wanted to. And yet, those pairs in those packs, they still maintain their bonds year round, even though they're not mating. They're still traveling together, they're still defending the territory together, and they're raising the litter together. So they still maintain this really tight bond, even in the fall when there is no raising the litter to really do, and there's not much in the way of defending. They don't have to defend their territories as much because the hormone levels of the whole population has dropped, and yet they're still together almost every day and almost every night. So really, really tight mated pairs, more so than you would find for a lot of other species.
Wow. That's cool.
So you didn't expect that, but there's all kinds of little nuggets that we've run across over the years, so that we've actually spent a tremendous amount of time, work, effort to be able to document. But it's just, they're amazing animals, and it's amazing that they're able to live with us or among us, even though we're their biggest threat as far as the predator goes.
We're wrapping this up, but we could go on for another couple hours. So everybody listening, go get the book, Coyotes Among Us. I just want to say thanks for joining us. I mean, I think you're going to be doing a lot of time promoting the book and being on different kind of media and stuff. You're also running studies. You're also applying for grants and teaching and doing everything else. So we appreciate that you took almost 2 hours to chat with us.
Sure.
Thank you very much for the time. And this has been fascinating.
Well, I appreciate it too. I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to share the coyote stories. So that's why we do the research, is to provide people with the information. So you're helping us to accomplish that goal.
It's an honor. Cheers.